Every morning before the sun peeked over the hangars of Fort Lincoln, a woman in faded coveralls pushed her mop down the same hallway. No salute. No one called her Mum. To most, she was just the janitor. Some even snickered behind her back and called her Ghost Mop. No one remembered her name. But one day, when a foreign diplomat collapsed during a high-level meeting and no one could understand his final words, she spoke. And in that one sentence, clear, calm, and fluent in a language no one else in the room understood, everything changed. Her name was Helen Carter, and for nearly a year, she had quietly cleaned the most sensitive corridors in the base. Wing C, home to international intelligence and logistics. She moved with precision, never drawing attention, never asking questions. She never argued when young officers talked down to her, never corrected them when they joked about her being too quiet to be useful. Second Lieutenant Matt Rayleigh once called out to her, "Hey, Ghost Mop, you missed a spot. Or maybe you just don't speak English." Helen didn't flinch. She tied up the trash bag, pushed her cart, and walked away. Captain Doug Landon, who saw the exchange from down the hall, didn't say anything at the time. But that same night, Rayleigh found himself reassigned to latrine duty. For 2 weeks straight. No explanation, no appeal. Just silence. Some folks whispered that Helen had friends in high places. Others thought she was just strange. No one guessed the truth. What no one saw was the life Helen Carter had walked away from. And why? 15 years earlier, she wore a very different uniform. Back then, she didn't mop floors. She spoke fluent Arabic, Farsi, Russian, Mandarin, and 5 other languages. She'd been a linguistic intelligence officer, operating under deep cover for a joint task force out of Langley. Her work was so classified, even her commanding officers didn't know her full clearance level. And then, one mission in Morocco went sideways. Her name was scrubbed from every record. No ceremony. No retirement party. She just vanished, until she quietly reappeared one day, as a janitor, on an American base that didn't know it had a silent watchdog walking its halls. Helen lived alone in a small rented apartment above a mechanic's shop in town. Her walls were bare, her fridge half empty, and under her bed, locked in an old wooden box, were the medals, files, and photographs of a woman no one remembered, but who had once helped prevent a war with just her voice. She didn't return to service for recognition. She came back because she sensed something was wrong. And she was right. The warning signs came slowly. A diplomat she recognized from Damascus years ago, suddenly appearing on base under NATO clearance. A subtle shift in base chatter, lapses in translated intel, words used that didn't quite fit their dialect. Helen knew. Someone was probing the base from the inside. So she waited. She listened. She filed mental notes as she mopped beneath open doors and briefing rooms. And then came the meeting. A foreign liaison collapsed mid-sentence during the closed-door session. Officers froze, not because of the collapse, but because they realized no one understood his final words. Until the janitor stepped forward. She dropped her mop, looked straight at the general, and spoke in fluent Ukrainian. He said, "They've already breached the comms net. Shut down Channel 7. General Thomas Halbrook turned pale. That sentence saved the base. But it wasn't the sentence that stunned him. It was the voice, clear, trained. American, but not a janitor's voice. A voice that once translated surrender agreements in war zones. A voice that had once warned him years ago about a mole in Kandahar. Halbrook cleared the room, and for the first time really looked at her. She handed him a sealed envelope from the box under her bed, one he hadn't seen in over a decade. Inside was a personnel file marked Carter, Helen, Linguistic Intelligence, Level A6 clearance. Stunned, he asked, "Why come back?" She answered softly, "Because I heard the wrong people saying the right things, and no one was listening." That afternoon, she didn't go back to cleaning. Instead, she suited up in a black flight suit, unmarked but unmistakable. By nightfall, she had identified a rogue surveillance drone cloaked near the base. Using an override from an old Reaper drone still mothballed in storage, and a launch code she herself had written years ago. She took it down before it could transmit stolen intel. The next morning, she walked into the mess hall, not in coveralls, but in full uniform. Her badge now read, Helen Carter, Lieutenant Commander, Linguistic Intelligence Corps. No one said a word. They simply stood aside as she passed, the same way they had for a janitor, but this time with respect. Because sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one holding the line between peace and chaos. And sometimes, the person pushing the mop knows exactly which words could start a war, and exactly how to stop them. The mop never made a sound on the polished concrete of Wing C, but Helen Carter's footsteps once echoed in marble corridors of embassies from Tripoli to Tbilisi. She'd sat in war rooms without names, spoken in voices that didn't belong to her, and brokered fragile truces while bombs ticked under the floor. 15 years ago, before anyone called her Ghost Mop, she was Lieutenant Commander Helen Carter, language operative under Shadow Division, a joint unit so buried in black budgets, most generals never knew it existed. She was their ghost long before she became the base janitor, and no one had ever connected the two. It wasn't just her gift for language. It was her ear. Helen could listen to 3 dialects at once, isolate a regional inflection, and know if a coded phrase meant a supply drop or an ambush. She didn't just translate. She read intention. Tone silence. She understood the spaces between words, and for over a decade that made her invaluable. She'd worked the darkest corners of U.S. intelligence, a Kandahar, where she interrogated defectors in smoke-filled rooms behind double-blind glass, a Casablanca, where she once posed as a French oil executive to intercept a trade of satellite codes, a Beirut, where she spent 6 days negotiating with a militia commander to release captured aid workers, switching from Levantine Arabic to Pashto to Farsi without hesitation. But it all ended in Morocco. The file is still sealed. Helen never spoke of it, not even to the general, but whispers exist among the few who were close enough to the edge to hear them. A deal gone bad. A mole inside the U.S. delegation. An American asset compromised in Rabat. Helen had warned them. She flagged the wrong phrasing in an intercepted message, a shift in verb tense, subtle but off, that indicated a trap. Her superiors dismissed it, said she was being too cautious. The meeting went forward, and 3 agents never came back. She blamed herself for not shouting louder, for not disobeying the order, for letting protocol win over instinct. She submitted a resignation. It was denied. So instead she vanished, not with fanfare or flag ceremonies, but with a form no one questioned and a silence no one broke. The only evidence of her time in service now lived in a weathered box beneath her bed, but a cracked wristwatch with the numbers half faded stopped at the moment the radio went dead in Casablanca. A photograph of 3 men, their eyes blurred with pencil scratches, and a letter never sent, addressed to Mother, back home in Idaho, signed simply, "I'm safe, but no longer the person you knew." Helen didn't come to Fort Lincoln by accident. She chose it. The base had a reputation for administrative laxity, frequent personnel turnover, relaxed protocol enforcement, a perfect place for a quiet observer to melt into the background. She signed on as a janitor using her real name, no aliases. That was part of the trick, hide in plain sight. She knew no one would suspect the woman with rubber gloves and bleach on her boots, and for years no one did. But Helen was always listening, not with suspicion, but with the intuition of someone who knew how patterns formed, and how wars began in whispers long before they echoed in headlines. So when foreign phrases started showing up in the wrong context, when Turkish officers began using outdated codes, or Arabic liaisons mispronounced key terms, she noticed. And when she saw Colonel Mikhail Rostov, the old Russian liaison with too many secrets and too few fingerprints, appear on the visitor manifest, her pulse changed. She remembered him from Damascus, during a tense hostage exchange that never made the news. He had flanked a commander who didn't officially exist, spoken only in low-register Farsi, and smiled like a man who never forgot a face. Now he was here, on American soil with NATO clearance, and that meant the game wasn't over. It had just gone silent. That night Helen sat at the edge of her narrow twin bed, opened the old wooden box, and pulled out the photograph. There he was, Rostov, 20 pounds thinner, 1 scar less. She traced the edge of the photo with a calloused finger. He hadn't seen her yet, but he would. Tomorrow, she would return to work. Same coveralls, same mop, same cart. But this time, she wasn't just cleaning floors. She was watching. And if anyone whispered the wrong word in the wrong tongue, in the wrong tone, she'd know. because Helen Carter may have walked away from the shadows, but she never forgot how to hear them. Helen Carter didn't speak often, but when she did, she could choose from 9 languages and make each one sound like it was the only tongue she'd ever known: Arabic, Russian, Farshto, French Mandarin, Spanish, German, Turkish, and of course, English, flat and precise, like a scalpel. Most people only ever heard her ask if they wanted her to come back after the floor dried. But Helen had once talked warlords into laying down arms just by switching dialects mid-sentence. She'd corrected interpreters from embassies, stopped drone strikes with a phrase, and exposed double agents from the slight stress on a syllable. She didn't carry a weapon. Her brain was the weapon. So when she saw the name on the manifest that morning, her fingers tensed just slightly on the mop handle. Colonel Mikhail Rostov, Russian diplomatic liaison, NATO clearance, full access to Wing C. But Helen knew better. The last time she saw Rostov, there was no handshake, no ceremony, just a concrete floor in Damascus and 3 silent men with hollow eyes. He'd been younger then, more dangerous, but his voice, low, confident, and always a hair slower than it needed to be, hadn't changed. And if he was here, something was wrong. The official line said he was part of a standard NATO delegation. Routine inspection, nothing more. But Helen had learned long ago routine is just what they call it before something breaks. That night, back in her tiny apartment above the mechanic's shop, she opened the wooden box under her bed. She pulled out a worn sheet of notes from an old field briefing, Rostov Tactical Manipulator. Uses linguistic ambiguity to stall or provoke. Below that, scrawled in faded pencil, don't let him speak longer than 20 seconds unchecked. She didn't sleep that night. She didn't need to. The language center of her brain was already assembling a map. Code patterns, dialects, stress points. She ran phrases through her head like drills: border corridor, joint ops, temporary station. All of them harmless alone, and all of them weaponized in the wrong mouth. The next morning, the base prepared for the diplomatic visit. Flags were raised. Boots were shined. The general stood tall, and Helen Carter mopped the floors of the main conference room like she always did, quiet, invisible, perfectly positioned. Then he walked in, older, slower, but unmistakable. Rostov scanned the room like a chessboard. His eyes stopped on her, just a fraction of a second longer than they should have. Recognition. He didn't speak. Neither did she. But in that second, everything clicked into place. This wasn't a visit. This was a probe. And if she didn't act soon, someone was going to open the wrong door, with the wrong words. As the meeting began, Helen remained at the edge of the room, clipboard in hand, coveralls unzipped halfway, like she belonged to no one. But she was listening, and Rostov kept glancing her way, not long enough to be noticed by others, but often enough for her to know he remembered. She scanned the room. Her eyes saw things no one else was trained to notice. A badge hanging too low. A translator with nervous hands. A folder marked for civilian use in a room that should have been military only. The cracks were small, but Helen didn't need more than a word. When Rostov finally stood to speak, something shifted. His tone was warm, measured, but in Russian he used an archaic phrase. EDB. On paper it meant, wartime is your opportunity. But in the old manuals from Soviet SOPs, it was a signal, a prompt for operatives to activate buried protocols. Helen felt it in her spine. He was triggering something. The general looked confused. The officers around the table took notes, none of them understanding what just passed between the lines. Helen stepped forward, silent as a shadow, and deliberately dropped her clipboard. The metallic crack drew every eye. Rostov turned to her slowly. He asked, "How long have you been cleaning this room?" She answered without hesitation, 10 months, twice a day. He smiled as if amused. "What's your name?" "Just Helen," she said. He nodded slightly. "Do you remember Istanbul?" The room stiffened. The general started to intervene, but Helen didn't blink. "I remember the river," she replied. "And the boy you left behind, Nikita." The temperature in the room dropped 5 degrees. Rostov's face lost its smirk. Every officer in that room now knew. The janitor wasn't a janitor. General Halbrook stepped forward. "Helen," he said, "do you have something to say?" She turned toward him, eyes calm. "Sir," she said, "I need to speak to you. Alone now. Because a breach was already happening. Because the enemy wasn't at the gate. He was already inside the room. And because only one person on that base could translate what was really being said and stop what was coming next." By the time the conference room emptied and the last four in uniform stepped off the polished floor, General Thomas Halbrook stood still, silent, staring at the woman he thought he'd known. Helen Carter stood opposite him. Her posture was calm, her voice steady, but her eyes had changed, no longer the quiet janitor. Now they carried the weight of someone who'd been trained to hear war. Not when it erupted, but when it whispered. "Sir," she said, placing a sealed black pouch on the table, "you have a breach on this base. It's already active." Inside the pouch was a single folder, thick manila, stamped with 3 insignias, 1 US, 1 NATO, and one so faded it was barely readable. Halbrook opened it. The first page read Carter, Helen, Lieutenant Commander, Linguistic Intelligence Corps Shadow Division deactivated. He looked up, stunned. "You're her." She nodded.
"Yes, sir."
"You were wiped from every registry after Morocco. I was never meant to stay above water." Halbrook sat down slowly, eyes scanning the details. His voice was softer now. "Why come back?" "Because I heard mistakes," she said. "Phrases in the wrong dialects, instructions phrased just off enough to mean something else. And then I saw Rostov." Her tone sharpened. "He's not here to cooperate. He's here to map soft targets. I heard it in the way he said window of opportunity. That wasn't diplomacy. That was code." Halbrook rubbed his jaw. "Do we have a problem?" "We don't yet," Helen replied, stepping toward a terminal built into the wall. "But I think we're being watched." She keyed into the secure feed, her fingers moving with trained precision. Passwords decades old still worked. She'd written them. On screen, a satellite image of the base flickered to life. A red heat signature pulsed just outside the eastern hangar perimeter, right where no personnel should have been. "There," she said. "Behind the old weather array, something's moving." "Thermal signature?" Halbrook asked. "No," Helen said flatly. "That's not weather. That's a drone. Russian-built. Camouflaged. Watching our reaction speeds." Halbrook's face tightened. "How long has it been there?" "Too long," she said. "And it's probably transmitting. If it gets airborne, we lose more than footage. We lose classified telemetry." She turned and headed toward the door. "Where are you going?" Halbrook called. "To stop it," she said. "But I need access to Bay C." His hesitation lasted less than a breath. Then he rose, grabbed his badge, and followed her. Bay C was a forgotten vault beneath the main hangars, a relic of the last decade's tech. Dust lined the racks of dormant Reaper drones, their wings tucked like sleeping vultures. Helen moved straight to the second unit on the left. She knew it by memory. "This one's still patched to the legacy net," she said. "Manual override. No biometric lockout." Halbrook raised an eyebrow. "You remember the code?" She gave a small smile. "I wrote it." The drone hummed to life. Soft at first, then steady, like a heartbeat returning after a long sleep. She calibrated the sensors, realigned the optics, and input target coordinates. "What's the window?" Halbrook asked. 17 seconds, she said. "That's all we'll have once it detects the launch. And then it climbs, cloaks, and vanishes, and every byte it's stolen goes with it." Halbrook nodded once. The Helen hit launch. The Reaper rose without sound, slicing the air with silent efficiency. On screen, the rogue drone shimmered behind a rusted cargo shell. Then it jerked. It saw the threat. It lifted fast, almost straight up. "Too late," Helen said. She pressed engage. The Reaper lock, a single burst, not explosive, but electromagnetic, ruptured the enemy drone's core mid-air. It dropped like a stone, landing just outside the perimeter fence. Smoke curled from its remains. On the screen, the red signature faded. Silence returned. Halbrook stared at the monitor, then at Helen. "How long?" he asked. "Did you say you were a janitor?" Helen peeled off the gloves she'd worn every day for nearly a year. "Long enough," she said. "Long enough to learn where the real dirt hides." By sunrise, the breach was officially undetected. Rostov was gone within 12 hours. Sighting, scheduling conflicts. No one asked questions. They didn't need to. But the base had changed, and so had Helen Carter. The next morning, as officers filed into the mess hall, the whispers began. "She's not cleaning today. Where'd she go?" Was that her in the flight suit? Standing at the edge of the hall, in full black utilities with silver insignia and a clearance badge now reading LT. Helen Carter, Linguistic Threat Division. She simply nodded to the soldiers who used to ignore her. They stepped aside. No one asked questions anymore, because now they knew the quiet woman with the mop had saved them all, not with a rifle, but with a reaper and a sentence only she could understand. The base had already started to forget the near disaster. Officially, the breach never happened. No press release, no debriefing memo, no acknowledgement of the drone that fell in a smoldering heap just beyond the eastern fence line. But something had changed. The soldiers could feel it. The tension that used to hum through the corridors had quieted. The unease, that sense that something was off, had lifted like the smell of ozone after a passing storm. And the woman who had once polished the very floor they stood on wasn't pushing a mop anymore. She stood at the front of the mess hall that morning, not in her faded coveralls but in a sleek charcoal flight suit, collar high, cuffs crisp. Her hair was pulled back. Her eyes were steady, and clipped to her chest, glinting in the morning light, was a silver badge that read LT Commander Helen Carter, Linguistic Threat Division Clearance Level Alpha 6. No one called her Ghost Mup now. No one dared. It wasn't just the uniform that silenced the room. It was the presence, the quiet precision with which she stood, the stillness of a person who had once been invisible on purpose, and was now seen, completely, by everyone who had overlooked her for months. General Halbrook arrived just behind her, his expression solemn but proud. He stepped to the center of the room and cleared his throat. "You all know her," he said. "But none of you knew her." He turned toward Helen. "This base owes you more than thanks. It owes you security. The kind we didn't realize we'd lost until you gave it back." He looked around the room. "Lieutenant Commander Carter has been officially reinstated by special authorization. Effective immediately, she will lead our newly formed Linguistic Threat Response Cell, reporting directly to Joint Strategic Command." A murmur rippled through the ranks. Her mission, Halbrook continued, was to intercept, decode, and neutralize emerging linguistic infiltration tactics before they turn into the next kind of war. He paused, then added, "And let me be clear, if anyone on this base questions her authority because of the uniform she used to wear, the one with bleach stains and rubber soles, they can answer to me." Silence fell again. Then, slowly, people began to rise, not with the military stiffness of protocol, but something deeper, something earned. They stood because they understood, finally, who had really been protecting them all along. Later that day, Helen entered the command vault, a room hidden 2 levels below the operations wing. The air there was cold, the walls steel. This was where she belonged. Her new office wasn't large. It wasn't grand, but it was quiet, lined with screens, encrypted terminals, and stacks of real-time intercepts from across the globe. Languages from every conflict theater buzzed through the comm lines. Arabic radio chatter, Russian backchannel logs, Mandarin intercepts tagged for semantic drift. Helen listened like most people breathe, and when something sounded off, just slightly wrong, she circled it. A single word with the wrong tonal pitch could indicate a false flag operation. A pronoun dropped in Farsi could suggest a shift in faction allegiance. She caught them all. Her team wasn't large, 5 officers handpicked from 3 branches, but she trained them personally, not with textbooks, but with field logic. "Don't just listen to what they say," she told them. "Listen to what they're not saying. Listen to what they're hiding inside what sounds routine." And when one young recruit, fresh out of linguistics school, nervously asked, "How did you learn all this?" Helen gave a quiet smile. "By mopping the hallways no one cared about, and listening to the conversations they never meant me to hear." Within a month, her unit intercepted a misrouted comm in West Africa, a seemingly harmless request for water filters. But Helen caught the anomaly. The phrase used for clean water had an idiomatic shift only known in certain militant circles. They stopped a planned sabotage attack 2 days before it started. No alarms, no headlines, just silence maintained. At shift change that evening, a young airman passed her in the corridor, the same corridor where, not long ago, she used to mop around his boots. He stepped aside now, back straight, eyes respectful. "Mom," he said, nodding. Helen nodded back. Didn't break stride, she didn't need applause. Her work was never about recognition. It was about listening before anyone else heard the danger. It was about reading the world one syllable at a time, and it was about knowing, without a doubt, that the greatest threats never announce themselves in bombs or bullets, but in softly spoken words, buried inside conversations no one thought she could understand, because once they thought she was just the janitor. Now, she's the one person standing between peace and the moment everything falls apart. The general waited until the room was empty. The lights dimmed to a low hum inside the secure command vault. Only the gentle flicker of the surveillance screens lit the space, casting soft blue shadows across steel walls and polished floor. Lieutenant Commander Helen Carter stood by the table, hands clasped behind her back, her badge still fresh, but her face already marked by years of stories untold. The silver insignia on her collar shimmered, but it was her silence that seemed to fill the room. General Thomas Halbrook finally spoke. "You saved this base, Helen," he said quietly. "You saved it before we even knew it needed saving." She didn't reply right away. She had learned, long ago, that silence speaks louder than most words. "I didn't do it for thanks, sir," she said. "I did it because too many people think war starts with a bang. It doesn't. It starts with a word. Misplaced, mistranslated, misunderstood." Halbrook nodded slowly. "I thought I knew what command meant," he admitted. "But you've taught me something I should have known better. That authority doesn't always wear a uniform. And that wisdom can come from the quietest corner of the room." He looked at her, really looked at her. No longer as the janitor he'd passed 100 times without notice, but as the guardian she had always been. "I need you to stay," he said, his voice lower now. "Not because of protocol, not because of rank, but because these kids, they don't know what you know. And if we don't have you listening, someone's going to die over a verb they didn't recognize." Helen turned to him, her face unreadable as always. Then, finally, she nodded. "I already knew I'd stay," she said. "I just needed to hear you ask." She didn't ask for a promotion. She didn't want a ceremony, and when the Pentagon offered her a full retirement with honors, she declined. What she asked for instead was a simple desk inside the linguistics hub she helped establish. A team, a mission, and most importantly, access to the raw feed, the live transmissions, the intercepts, the chatter no one else had time to filter. Because Helen Carter knew the danger wasn't always in the explosions. It was in the silences between sentences. She started leading early morning briefings. Quietly, efficiently. Young officers from every branch would sit, some unsure why a civilian had been handed so much control. Then they'd hear her speak, and within 5 minutes, no one doubted anything. She broke down a single intercepted phrase in Dari that had two meanings: deliver supplies or deliver hostages. One pause in the wrong spot, she explained, and entire lives were at stake. She taught them to listen beneath language, to hear intention, to watch tone, to pay attention when something felt too clean, too rehearsed, too perfect. "You won't get medals for this," she told them one morning, "but you might stop a war. That's enough." General Halbrook visited her one evening months later. The sun had dipped behind the ridge, painting the sky a soft orange. The base was quiet, secure. "You ever miss it?" he asked. "The field?" Helen smiled faintly, eyes fixed on the satellite feed across her screen. "I miss the adrenaline sometimes," she said. "But I don't miss guessing what the next word could cost." He was quiet for a long moment. "I used to think command was about giving orders," Halbrook said. "Now I think it's about listening, really listening, even to people you've been trained to overlook." Helen looked at him then, not as an officer to a superior, but simply one human being to another. "Command is earned," she said, "not from medals, but from knowing when to shut up and hear what no one else is hearing." She stayed at Fort Lincoln for another 3 years. Under her watch, 5 coordinated attacks were quietly intercepted before they reached American soil. 12 linguistic anomalies were flagged and corrected before they could be used as digital traps, and not a single soldier died from a misinterpreted command. She never raised her voice. She never asked for credit. But people started to sit up straighter when she entered a room. They knew who she was now, not because of a title, not because of a badge, but because they'd finally learned what true leadership looked like, a woman who had once been invisible, a mind trained to hear danger before it had a name, and a heart that refused to walk away when lives were on the line, even if no one ever saw her coming, because some people protect with weapons. She protected with words, and in a world full of noise, she was the one who listened, until silence meant safety again. We live in a world where noise often takes the spotlight, loud titles, flashy uniforms, bold opinions. But sometimes it's the quiet ones who carry the greatest wisdom. Sometimes, the person nobody notices is the one who notices everything. Helen Carter was a janitor, or so everyone thought. But beneath the coveralls and mop bucket lived a mind trained to stop wars before they began. She didn't speak loudly. She didn't command rooms. She just listened, carefully, patiently, constantly. And when the moment came, she didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for permission to be great. She simply did what was right. Because lives were on the line. Never underestimate quiet strength. Never ignore the person sweeping the floor, sitting in the back, or speaking in soft tones. Because in this life, true power doesn't always wear medals. Sometimes it wears humility. And sometimes it's wrapped in silence. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone in your life who never asked for credit, but always showed up when it mattered, take a moment to honor them in the comments below. Type respect if you believe every quiet hero deserves to be seen. And if you want more stories like this, stories that uplift the unseen and remind us of the quiet courage all around us, subscribe to the channel. Because the world needs to hear the voices that once chose to stay silent.